This is Kirk McKnight, author of The Voices of Baseball, and you're listening to Jim on Base.
Welcome to the Jim on Base podcast. My name is Jim Stevens, and this is the podcast that catches you up with some of your favorite athletes and other entertainment figures. Welcome back to another episode of the Jim on Base show. For today's very special guest, we have on the author of The Voices of Baseball, the game's greatest broadcasters reflect on America's pastime. It's a great book, and he's also authored The Voices of Hockey and another book, Batting Clean, Why Dale Murphy Belongs in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He's currently the associate editor for the Wickenburg Sun in Arizona. Please welcome the great Kirk McKnight. Kurt, thanks for coming on.
Thanks. I'm not sure about the great, but thank you for having me.
No, it's great to have you on. And we met not long ago, about a week ago. You were in Scottsdale at spring training. We met in the press box. And weren't you catching up with broadcaster Jon Miller?
I was. Yeah, I just kind of said hello in passing since I knew I'd probably run into him. John's one of those stalwarts that still does spring training games. Most of the guys who are Hall of Famers and have been broadcasting as long as he have, they usually stay at their homes and they forego spring training and wait for the regular season. They save their pace for the regular season, but not Jon. John's been there from the very beginning, so it's great to see him.
Yeah, it was very surreal for me, too, because I think I talked to you and said, hey, is the broadcast door open? It was kind of a memorable moment for me because I could hear his iconic voice coming down the hallways, and it was pretty neat.
Yeah, he's definitely one of those voices where you're walking by and you stop and say, I know that voice. And honestly, that's happened on a couple occasions with my interviews, especially when I would do an interview in public. You know, people would recognize the voice and kind of have to do a double take, and there they are.
Yeah. Well, you also you played it smart, too, because you wore a Giants hat to the stadium. So that was a smart move.
It was, and I kept the Giants hat off for the first part of my experience there because I was actually there in the press box doing an interview with Cleveland Guardians radio voice Jim Rosenhaus to do a promo for the book during a Guardians pregame broadcast as well.
Oh, wow. So you're getting around.
I've been getting around, and I'm very fortunate to live out here in Arizona and be basically a half hour from the nearest spring training site and maybe an hour and 20 minutes from the farthest. So it's been a good blessing, and it's been good to have half the league out here, especially at this time where the book's about to drop, and able to kind of get into these other markets, basically try to get into half the markets of baseball while they're basically right here at my fingertips. That doesn't really happen any other time except for in spring training, either on this side of the country or over there in Central Florida.
Yeah, well, it makes me wonder, is that how you were able to do a recent update? Because the book came out a few years ago, right? And now you've updated it from 35 broadcasters to now 50 play-by-play announcers, right?
Yeah, most of the interviews I've done now have been phoners. So that's the thing. The relationship I've been able to build with a lot of these broadcasters, they're okay with, just scheduling some interview in the morning or at night or whatever it is. They're pretty accommodating. They know me by now, and they're happy to oblige, and really gracious people.
Yeah, I've had Jon Miller on, some other broadcasters, and for me, I always get a kick out of it. But for you, it must have been pretty surreal because, you've had Jon Miller, Vin Scully, Dick Enberg, Bob Uecker, Bob Costas, just to name a few. So that must have been pretty surreal for you.
It really is, and I don't ever want to say I'm used to it by now, because I'm not. Speaking with somebody like Bob Costas over the summer, it was really just the voice, the smooth, silky voice of Bob Costas, and the bounding knowledge that he has on the game, on broadcasting in and of itself. Just a great experience to have. When you interview the great Vin Scully, which I did in 2014, you basically, that's a high you really can't come down from. A lot of people talk about how when they go skydiving, it gets to be a pretty depressing life because you're never going to catch that high again. But talking with people like Bob Costas and Bob Uecker over the summer have been really surreal experiences in and of themselves as well.
Well, how did you get to reach out and contact them? What was your method, or how did you make it happen?
Well, some of these broadcasters, it was just broadcaster to broadcaster. For a lot of them, though, it was basically going right through the media relations, the directors of broadcasting, public relations in some cases, the radio affiliates, whatever it would be. But it was a mixture of both. I was able to get Jon Miller's interview set up because of an interview I did with Eric Nadel of the Texas Rangers, who is a friend of John's. And, he basically put the word out. I interviewed him on a Monday in 2014. I got a text on a Tuesday giving me Jon Miller's contact info, and then on a Thursday I got the return call from Jon, and on Friday I had the interview with Jon. So it took it did. It seems like a short amount of time, but when you're on a segmented trip, you're kind of white knuckled there that last day, knowing you're going to be heading back home, and is this opportunity going to slip? Is it not going to happen? And luckily, we were able to have that interview that last day. I was down here for spring training, and I was able to go home and drive back to Vegas on a big high.
Wow, yeah. Well, it's got to be special too to tell their stories because, as you know, Vin Scully, Dick Enberg, I mean, they've passed away, so you're really getting to have some special moments with people that can't really happen again,
Yeah, I mean, and another Hall of Famer that I spoke with over the summer who just recently passed away was Tim McCarver. And basically meeting Dick Enberg in 2016 and interviewing him in his broadcast booth at Petco Park in San Diego. At that time he was in his 60th and final year broadcasting. He decided to retire the same year as Vin, which turned out to be probably a a bit of a comical thing when you consider all the fanfare that Vin was getting. And you also got Dick Enberg, but not so much fanfare for Dick as there was for Vin. Charlie Steiner actually made the joke to Mr. Enberg, saying, "Buddy, you retired. You chose the wrong year, buddy." and that's funny to think about. We all know that Dick Enberg is a legend, not in his own sphere, just a legend universally. It's just that Vin Scully is the ultimate when it comes to broadcasting, and so you are going to kind of be not so much in the spotlight when a moment like that happens, and it's a season-long farewell to Vin.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because I had a pretty surreal moment for me just growing up a Giants fan. It was pretty special, though, to be at Vin's final game as a broadcaster. I was able to see him broadcast against the Giants in San Francisco, and they showed him on the Jumbotron. And I remember they handed out signs that said something like, "Thank you, Vin." So pretty surreal. And was it nerve-wracking to interview him?
He puts you at ease very quickly. You say Mr. Scully, and he quickly corrects you and says, please call me Vin. That's the kind of person he is. And not only that, I mentioned this in tribute chapter to Vin at the end of the book, to kind of step out of the narrator role and basically give a first person account of my personal experience with Vin and interviewing him. And he basically, he realizing and knowing he's calling a journalist who is writing a book on baseball broadcasting, and I understood and knew who it was as soon as he said hello. And he says, "I'm Vin Scully, and I broadcast baseball for the Los Angeles." He's giving me the whole introduction as if I couldn't tell it was him when he said hello. And that's what I loved about it, is that he, having, basically broadcast all these years and having been in the Hall of Fame for however many amount of years before this interview, still has that humility about him to introduce himself and tell you what he does.
Well, it's got to be cool too. I mean, I was thinking, do you get nervous talking to these guys? But when you're so used to hearing that iconic voice, does it almost take the surrealness away? It's almost like you're just listening on the radio, right? But he's talking directly to you.
It does have that feel to it. And you kind of have to catch yourself in the interviews, because when you hear their voice, you realize you're talking to an in-person or just an embodiment of a living legend, and people that somebody and everyone's going to talk about for years to come. Talking with Bob Uecker, you try not to get too caught up in that moment, because you got to be quick to talk to these guys, because they have very little time as it is. Their schedules are so busy, they're fitting you into them. And so you basically have to just put that aside for a second and just kind of channel some other kind of energy and not really feel so overwhelmed by the moment.
Do you also have to kind of find a challenge within yourself to ask questions that maybe haven't been asked before? Because the Bob Ueckers, the Bob Costas, the Vin Scullys, they've told their stories in other ways. Is it a challenge to find a new way to tell that story?
I tried to stick to a formula throughout all the interview process and ask them their most memorable games, just anything that makes the ballpark unique, and just maybe who they looked up to, any ballpark they may be missing that's no longer there. And so you just try to have that formula. And obviously, when you ask somebody like, "Oh, what's your most memorable game?" Maybe that's a question they've been asked a million times, and sometimes they just can't think of one. And that was like the first thing with my interview with Euchre was that he says, I don't really know, I can't think. And so you're thinking, oh my gosh, okay, how much more time do I have on the clock here? and so you rebound and try to do a different angle, try to basically play to their personalities, and play also just to kind of read the room. Sometimes a broadcaster is a little get to the point, and sometimes the person just makes you feel very at ease and just lets you flow with your questions and is happy to give you the time that they're happy to give you.
Well, you talked about being in the broadcast booth with guys like Dick Enberg. What was maybe the most surreal moment? Was there ever a moment where you thought, how is this happening?
There's a couple of moments. One would be it was a Sheridan in Scottsdale, that interview I had with Jon Miller, and I'm opening up my computer and pulling out my interviewing software, and I'm typing in the file, Jon Miller, and I'm giving myself pause because I'm just taking in the moment, getting a little choked up and thinking, oh my gosh, this is really happening. This is the pinch me moment of so far of this book. And that was one. And another one that comes to mind is interviewing John Sterling of the Yankees. Being a Yankee fan myself and listening to John's broadcast so many times, I interviewed him in Angel Stadium. I drove down from Vegas. I lived in Las Vegas for most of my life. I've only lived in Arizona for about a little over a year. And I went down to Anaheim and interviewed John, and just thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I'm interviewing John Sterling, because not only is John the voice of the Yankees, but John was the voice of the Atlanta Braves during my youth when I did follow the Braves religiously. He considered himself at that time, this was before he started broadcasting with the Yankees. And so he considered himself and called himself the junior member of the firm. Now, John Sterling is no junior member of any firm as far as anybody knows, because he's the lead voice of the Yankees, and he's on a national network, not just any local network. He is on WFAN, a nationally recognized network. But, he was a familiar voice to me even as a kid because he was doing the games for TBS and the Atlanta Braves. And so now I'm sitting there thinking, I can't believe I'm talking to a guy whose voice I've been listening to my whole life and watching and listening to baseball.
Yeah, that's pretty surreal. That was my experience with Jon Miller. I was like, is this a prank? Is this really him on the other end?
Very gracious man, Jon is, and he gives you plenty of time and he gives you plenty to work with if you're trying to get quotes and words and experiences. I had the good fortune of being able to interview him a few times for the original edition of the Voices of Baseball, because he helped me out with the Baltimore Orioles chapter. He basically volunteered it, and honestly, I hadn't gotten any Baltimore Orioles broadcasters up to that point. And now that I look back at it, and I think Jon was there when Cal Ripken broke Lou Gehrig's consecutive games played streak. And he basically captured not only the moment where the game became official and the number drops from the window, but leading up to that game, the fanfare, the pageantry that was happening at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, that was basically familiarizing the fans with what it really means and what it will mean when Cal officially breaks the record. It wasn't as simple as him walking onto the field and the first pitch being thrown. The game had to be an actually recorded, an official game before it's put in the books. So people leading up to that, I think his name is Dr. Steinberg, and he would play this music, and then they would have the rule on the big scoreboard at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, so that people understood that the team that is the home team, if it's going into the bottom of the fifth and they're leading, the game is official. Or if they're trailing, they have to play the fifth for the game to be official. And so people understood the rule, and that, it's not as simple as like, okay, let's throw out the fireworks. And so as soon as the third out was made in that fifth inning and they went to the bottom of the fifth, everybody at Oriole Park at Camden Yards knew that he had officially done it. And then hence they began the 30-minute celebration and the run around the ballpark and basically just turning already lengthened game as it was into an even longer game, and the broadcast carrying on and on.
Yeah, that was a special memory for me too, because it's kind of underrated. Because as you know, Jon Miller is mostly known, it seems like these days, as a Giants broadcaster. Not everyone always
Mm-hmm.
brings up the time he spent with the A's and the Orioles, and I think it was a special moment too, because I have a memory of him being in like a bow tie and having Bill Clinton in the booth with him during that game.
Yeah, and that's part of that Baltimore chapter is the fact that Bill is sitting there in the booth, and during the inning when Cal Ripken actually hits a home run. So it's Cal's night, and he actually hits a home run. He's making a difference in the game offensively, and Clinton is like overwhelmed and overcome with emotion, and he's sitting there like, go, go, yeah, and John's sitting there thinking, for a brief flash of a second, he's thinking, he is shouting me over, like he's upstaging me. But then he's thinking, he's like, wait a minute, this is the president of the United States. Like, what am I going to do? Call the White House and say, I don't want Bill Clinton ever in my booth again. He has no radio etiquette. He thought, well, it's the commander in chief leading the cheers. So I can't think of a more perfect way to really commemorate Cal breaking this record as having the president of the United States cheering on the broadcast.
Yeah, that's a great point and story. And, when you sit down with these guys too, is it a one-time sit down? Or because my fear always when I have someone that I like is as soon as it's over, I'm like, oh crap, I forgot to ask this, or I could have asked that. So have you had any of those moments?
I mean, there's been a few, but I've been able to retrace my steps a little bit and been able to get clarifications and get a little bit of elaboration in a sense with some of these broadcasters after the fact. They're usually pretty good about it. Just a simple, quick email, because I usually ask them if I can have their email when I finish the interview anyway, because I tell them I'd like to check their quotes with them before it publishes, and that's what I've kind of done. I've done that for every broadcaster I've ever interviewed and made sure that they're okay with it, and they appreciate that. And having that kind of trust and relationship makes it so that a second time around isn't such a tall glass.
Yeah. Well, have you learned anything about being around these broadcasters that maybe makes them all have a similarity or makes them all in common?
I mean, they just know the game so well, and they know the timing, they know everything about it, and the fact that the game is going to change and already has changed very much so going into this year. You can tell that this is something that the broadcasters are realizing they're going to have to tune the craft back to where it used to be. A perfect example was the other day when I was in the San Diego Padres booth with Jesse Agler and Tony Gwynn Jr. They tried to fit me in there for a half an inning to talk about the book, but with that pitch clock so quick, that you get one pitch and a pop up, and pretty soon you realize there's been 4 pitches thrown in a matter of 95 seconds, and the inning is over. And so they kept me on for the bottom half so I could finish the plug, and joked about it afterwards because the inning before the Padres played at 5 runs. And I joked with those guys, because we talked at the top of the 6th, but it was the top of the 5th they scored. I joked with them. I said, "Golf, if you guys would have had me on the top of the 5th, I could have read the whole book to you." And and that's just the pace of the game is going to be so great this year and moving forward. I'm very excited for it because nobody wants to sit there for 3 hours and 10 minutes and 3 hours and 20 minutes. Now the real problem, and I'm seeing this on social media, is that people are like, I better get all my stuff and sit down because I'm going to be out on that concourse and I could be missing 2 innings of the game waiting in line for this food. He's like, so they basically readjusted their schedule going into the game.
Yeah, now you got to make sure if that hot dog's worth it. Is it worth missing 2 innings?
I was sitting in line, basically getting a hot dog and it was going into the bottom of the 4th inning, and the line is moving slowly, and I'm thinking I've got to be in the booth in an inning and a half. Like, am I going to do this? And luckily, it sped up a little bit, and I was able to wharf it down before I went in, and I had my carb. I carved up and was ready to go for that 10-minute little radio interview.
Well, you talk about being in the booth with some of these guys, talking to them on the phone as well. Have you noticed, are their voices still the same when they're not broadcasting, or do you feel like maybe they doctor it up a little bit when they are on the air?
They do sound just the same, and that's what puts me at ease when I talk to them. I can see that throwing people off, and it would be interesting if they just had a different personality as soon as the on-air mic or the on-air light went off, and they just turned to you and all of a sudden talk to you in an English accent or whatever, or you know, or on the broadcast they got the Tennessee kind of twang to it, and then they talk to you and they sound like they're from Phoenix, Arizona. And you're just thinking, oh, but they're the same on the mic as off the mic. It pretty much seems it makes it a lot easier to realize you are talking to that person and not some masquerade of one.
I asked that because when I talked to Jon Miller, I thought, okay, he's going to dial it down a little bit. But it was, like you said, it was exactly the same.
Yeah, and they talk in their rhythms. They talk in their rhythms just like they broadcast in their rhythms, and it's because they just know how to tell the story. A good storyteller will not only understand the pace of it, but they also understand the dynamic of it. A lot of broadcasters would get really called out if they don't have the peaks and valleys that they do, and really be able to sell that call. If they get real deadpan and monotone, it really changes the way people listen to it, and it changes the experience.
Yeah. And you spoke about following the Braves when you were younger. What exactly gave you the idea to do this project, though? Because why broadcasters as opposed to, players or maybe managers? What kind of sticks with you when it comes to the broadcasting?
Well, the original purpose of the book, the seed that I planted in my mind, was to talk about how the ballparks play differently and how the game is different. See, this book is going to be all about the broadcasters' memories and everything like that. But if we take a couple of steps back and you start to realize, if you're a fantasy owner or if you're a gambling man even, and you start to understand the way the game is played and the science of it, the weather, the dimensions, everything like that, you realize that each ballpark is its own beast. And I thought, okay, I can do this and talk about this, but nobody wants to hear me giving a Fromer style tour through the ballparks and talking about like that. No, they want something that they can touch, something they can envision, and something they can imagine. And so when you think about it, you're like, okay, who really has this vast expansive knowledge? And it's the broadcasters, because they're there longer than the players, the managers. Sometimes they outlast management, the top brass, sometimes change hands while the broadcasters are still there. And Vin Scully basically followed the Dodgers out west when they left Brooklyn, and there you have right there, he basically introduces to the West Coast people the feel of radio broadcasting. That's something that Bob Costas brought up, is that people were in the stands with their transistor radios on, watching a game, but wanting more, to have Vin walk them through it and tell them and hear the stories. I mean, how you have it, you have everything right there in front of your eyes and in person. You have the smells, you have the sounds, you have all that, but you still feel to turn on that little transistor radio and have Vin basically, walk you through it.
No, that's a good point, because that's one thing I miss. I never was someone who put on the headphones and listened, but I remember as a kid and into my high school years, you could go to the game and you'd see the old timers wearing the headphones, listening to the radio, listening to Jon Miller and Dwayne Kuiper delivering the game. And, obviously there's an art to it.
Yeah, my dad was one of those old timers, and now even more so. You have better access to it. You can put the app on your phone, and no matter where you are, just tune into those radio broadcasts and not have to sit there and get a frequency. You just basically turn your phone on. That's what I did today, listening to a little bit of baseball during the day while I was at work, throwing on the game and listening to John Sterling call the Yankees and Aaron Judge hitting a home run his first at bat. And there you go. Technology is so much different than it was back when I first started, listening to baseball, because living in Las Vegas, we didn't have a sports team as far as on the major league level. And so we deferred to a Los Angeles broadcast and hearing Vin Scully on the radio, like on our nightly, listening jaunts. We would hear Vin broadcasting Dodger baseball from Dodger Stadium or wherever he was on the road. And here we are in Las Vegas. And The picture was still painted. It still was a great soundtrack to a summer's night.
Well, what's the biggest compliment you've received, or maybe a surreal moment through this entire process?
Oh, God. I do really appreciate people telling me that the book flows and that somebody basically told me they read it cover to cover within a couple of days. Those kinds of compliments really sound for me because that shows me that they really, that's one of the things as an author you want is somebody to basically not want to put down the book. And I've gotten compliments like that saying, I can't stop reading. I want to, but I can't. And those kinds of compliments really go a long way with me. And from the professional standpoint, the people that I spoke with, just getting their reviews, getting somebody's review and putting it on Amazon and putting it on the back cover, basically saying that, Ken Korach of the Oakland A's on the back cover of the book says that nobody has blended the ballparks and the broadcasting aspect together like I have. Just seeing that, even if it's just in an email, just seeing that means a lot to me. But seeing it on the back cover of the book means the world to me. And I made sure that the publisher, even with this updated edition, they wanted to put 2 or 3 reviews on there, and that's it. I said, you please make sure you put that one on there. Because that's the guy that I talked to before I talked to anybody else. He was the first broadcaster. That's symbolic to me. And that's the highest praise I feel I've gotten as far as in actual writing for the book.
No, that's pretty special. And you also had one from Bob Uecker too, right?
Bob Uecker, not necessarily a review of the book because he hasn't read it, but a little bit of a kind of an epitaph for the book, just a little shared experience that starts the book, talking about his baptism into broadcasting. But not as particular. Just a lot of times when they throw compliments, it's really a matter of them saying, "I'm grateful for you," kind of giving us this platform or giving us this moment in the spotlight. They've shared and shared their appreciation, not necessarily because they want their voices and their words to be documented and transcribed and all that. They appreciate their colleagues. They appreciate the guys that they see 3 games out of the year sometimes, but are looking forward to those moments. But, interleague games, this is the only time I get to see these guys. And they appreciate that. They appreciate that they get their chance just as well as the other guy gets their chance. And I think that speaks a lot for the camaraderie and the networking that happens among these broadcasters.
Well, you spoke about interviewing Vin Scully in 2014, and I've always heard from people that writing a book obviously isn't easy. So how long did it take you from start to finish?
Well, the first edition, that's the beauty of it, is that I had only written 2 chapters and only submitted 2 chapters as my agent was pushing the book, and I got a book deal with only 2 chapters written. I was used to being a screenwriter and writing a whole screenplay and having the door shut in my face. Now I've got the door open and I've only got 4% of the book written. So, but that really also helped to light the fire. It helped me to get the other interviews I needed to, and I believe from the time that my first interview my first interview was in December of 2013, and the book was submitted in December of 2014, and then released in August of 2015. So I wrote it over about 7 or 8 month period once I started interviewing more.
That's pretty fast.
Yeah, and it really helped with all the input these guys gave. And then since the book came out the first time, I've always gone back, and anything new happening, like I said, I have a relationship with these guys and reach out to them, say, do you mind giving me a comment about that? Say I can put one in the can, basically having an interview in the can and have some moments. And luckily I already had that strong foot forward when the publisher reached out to me last summer and said, hey, would you be interested in doing an updated edition of the book? And I'm like, yeah, I've already interviewed about 7 or 8 more people. And so much has happened since then. The Astros won the championship in 2017. So I had an interview in 2020 with Robert Ford. Then the Nationals won it all in 2019. And I did a follow-up interview with Charlie Slow, somebody I'd already talked to for the original edition of The Voice of Baseball. And you just kind of go along the way, and there's just more and more that I kind of gathered up. And then I got another additional 13 or 14 broadcasters from this edition than there were in the paperback edition, and an additional 17 from the hardcover edition when it came out in 2015.
Wow.
So I increased the roster about 50% from the original edition.
Is it true behind every author there's a strong woman named Colette, or?
For me, there is. I can imagine some of my friends' wives not being as supportive of them along a journey like this. But yeah, luckily I have a wife who's always believed in me and is very, very supportive and always ready to ask me how things are going and always ready to give me a hip, hip, hooray for he's a jolly good fellow whenever something good happens, whether it be working with the newspaper or getting a book published or whatever it is. She's always there to help me celebrate and bask in the good fortune.
Is she a sports fan, or how'd you guys meet, and do you have any kids?
She's not. She's not a sports fan. She does enjoy things about going to ballpark sometimes. It's I'll tell you, she has a lot more fun at a hockey game than she does a baseball game. We went to an Arizona Coyotes game about 3 weeks ago, and with the exception of the blaring music in that tiny arena, it's an NHL 5,000 seat arena for an NHL game. I'm thinking, what is going on here? And when you have a 5,000 seat arena and you have hockey style music playing, it's very loud really quick. So she went with me to Yankee Stadium, the old Yankee Stadium, the original, in its final season. I shouldn't say the original because we know that that wasn't really even the original Yankee Stadium. They renovated in the late 70s, and it was a completely different ballpark than the house that Ruth built. But that final year in 2008, we went to New York for a few days, and we did the tour. And after the tour of Yankee Stadium, she just said, "Wow, there is so much history here." I said, "Yeah, this is one of the most historic teams you'll ever come across in any sport, not just championship history, but just history. And some of the greatest players who ever played were on this field." And that's one of the things also about the book is there's another chapter that talks about the great ballparks of the past, and some of the ones like Tiger Stadium, Old Comiskey Park, and Yankee Stadium. Those are the kinds of stadiums that were there back in the early 1900s. And so players like Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth, obviously, and Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Seacott, talking about Old Comiskey. These are some of the players that, 100 years ago or 100 years, 110 years later, people are still talking about the way they just dominated the game. Oh, you asked if I have children too. I'm sorry. I do have one daughter. Her name's Adair, and she is kind of my travel buddy going to games. And I bribe her with the good treats that the ballpark has, and she can appreciate that. And she's always a good sport and tagging along with me because usually a road trip means she gets to play or Switch or something like that, play Minecraft in the drive out to the ballpark and back, and find the nice delicatessens that are offered in each of the ballparks, and get to have funnel cake fries in Atlanta and things like that, and all kinds of helmet Sundays in any ballpark we go to.
How old is she?
She's 12.
Is she a prospect in your eyes in becoming a writer? Or?
She is totally a prospect in writing. She is very imaginative, and she has a great way of words already. She is far ahead of whatever I was at 12 years old. And I felt like at 12 years old, I was writing creatively, but she is way ahead of her dad in that format. I've seen some of the stuff she writes, and I'm just thinking, wow, you really can paint a picture. You're very, very good. And that's one of the things about a storyteller is it's not so much the verbiage and the prose that you have. It's the picture you paint. And somebody that can basically imagine something with the right wording, that's a good writer. And I feel like she already is a good writer in that sense. And she's really leading you along and way ahead of my progress as a 12-year-old for sure.
Well, it's kind of funny that you say that because it made me think of one of the quotes I saw of Dick Enberg, kind of saying that's what it's like as a play-by-play announcer. TV, it's kind of easy, but as a radio announcer, you kind of have to paint the picture. So maybe behind every great broadcaster, they're good writers at heart,
Yeah, and I mean, I'll segue right into the Joe Musgrove no-hitter for San Diego, first no-hitter in team history. And that happened in 2021. And the people who called it were Jesse Agler and Tony Gwynn Jr., and they were calling it not in the ballpark. They were halfway across the country back in San Diego in the visiting team television booth with two makeshift tables laid out before them. Basically, the visiting broadcasters were not traveling at that time. There was still a lot of hangover from COVID. And these guys are calling this game watching on a monitor. But they had the responsibility, just as they do every other day, broadcasting on the radio, to paint the picture and put the fan in the seats. And they were putting themselves in the seats, honestly. And that was how they were able to do it. And when you call a no-hitter like that, sometimes the innings go by and you get distracted because there's so much superstition, and you're trying not to be the one who jinxes it. You're trying not to have it so focused. And the players, they try not to put too much emphasis on it, on the pitcher, and try to just leave them be and not psych them out or anything. And, these guys took the opportunity out during this no-hitter to kind of tell Joe Musgrove's story, and that he was, he grew up in San Diego. So he's basically playing, for the team that he would go to the ballpark and watch. Even in that young ballpark, he's young enough that he was a young fan going to Petco Park. We're not talking about Qualcomm, where the Padres used to play. They shared it with the Chargers. This new ballpark, and that just shows that he's young himself and basically playing for this team that he followed and watched, and now he's making history for them. So as the broadcasters, they really told this story as it went along, and it flowed, and it made the game less tense, I guess, probably for the people listening. They were enjoying it. Sometimes you get a little too antsy and you get a little too anxious when your team is in the middle of a no-hitter or a perfect game. It can be pretty anxiety-inducing for sure. And I think that, from the story they told, they did a good job of navigating that.
Well, Kirk, it's a great book that I'm excited to dive into myself. I haven't gotten to tackle the whole thing yet. But where can people get it? I know you can get it off Amazon, but is there a better way to get it?
You can get it on Amazon, or you can go through the publisher. That's Roman, ROWMAN.com. If you use coupon code RLFANDF30, you get 30% off. Use that coupon code, and you'll save $11 off of the Amazon price right there and then. So you got a little incentive. You got $11 more in your pocket.
Yeah. Well, I'll make sure to put all that in the episode bio as well, so people can see that. But Kirk, it was a lot of fun to have you on to talk some baseball with you. Excited to read the book, and it was nice meeting you the other day in the press box too.
Yeah, and what a beautiful stadium that is out there in Scottsdale. What a great atmosphere. You really feel like you're, they kind of configure that ballpark a lot like old, what's it now called, Oracle Park. So it did kind of seem like, except for there's no ocean there. You're out in the middle of the desert, no ocean, no regatta or anything like that. So it was what it was.
Well, hurry up and write some more books so I can have you on the show again.
Sounds good.
It's that easy, right?
Yeah, it is that easy. Well, I'll have one out tomorrow.
Well, do you have anything in the pipeline that you're thinking about or working on?
No, not really right now. I did have something that I was hoping for, but honestly, the fact that it didn't happen was a blessing to many of the teams. I had actually interviewed all the minor league teams that were on the chopping block back in 2019, 2020, when Manfred was going to contract the minors by 42 teams. Luckily, that didn't happen. Some towns did lose their team, and some they had a big old shift and switcheroo and all that. Some advanced while others descended. And to say that I wasn't able to write that project would be selfish if I were really wanting that to pull through, and so I was grateful that I didn't have to pull through with that project. That meant that there was baseball for all these small towns and their economies too. I mean, that was the point of the book, was taking out a team out of this summer league, even that economy, and some of those, especially back in the northeast part of the country, New England, stuff like that. You think about that is so much of their gross domestic product in a year, and basically telling them they won't be having that in perpetuity forever is just demoralizing. And so luckily they were able to save these minor league teams.
Yeah, definitely. That's great that they are able to stick around, still play some ball. And Kirk, hopefully one of these days maybe we can catch a game together, and don't be a stranger. It was fun to have you on the show, and again, thanks for the time, and I'll make sure to put the links out there, and everyone check out The Voices of Baseball. The game's greatest broadcasters reflect on America's pastime.
Thanks for having me on.
And there you have it. Hope you enjoyed my fun conversation with author Kirk McKnight. Make sure to pick up his book, The Voices of Baseball, on Amazon, or pick it up from the publisher for 30% off at rowman.com and use coupon code at checkout RLFANDF30 for 30% off. And don't forget to check out Kirk's other books, The Voices of Hockey and Batting Clean, Why Dale Murphy Belongs in Baseball's Hall of Fame. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't already, make sure to give us a follow on Twitter. And if you have any guest suggestions, shoot me an email at jimonbaseshow@gmail.com. And we'll see you on the next one.